Right now, somewhere out there, a video is circulating of a wild animal doing something it really shouldn't, according to everything we assume about survival instinct and self-interest. A wild dolphin nudging a drowning swimmer toward shore, a wild elephant gently pulling a struggling person out of dangerous floodwater, a whale positioning its enormous body beneath a diver caught in a shark's path. These stories keep showing up across completely different species, completely different regions, completely different circumstances, and they raise a remarkably strange question. Why would a wild animal, with no evolutionary reason to care about human survival, ever risk anything to help a member of an entirely different species? Let's dig into this properly, because the honest answer involves some real biology, some genuine scientific uncertainty, and a fair amount of caution about not reading too much human meaning into animal behavior that might be explained by something considerably simpler. Let's start with the most important framing point worth establishing up front, because it shapes how to think about every specific example discussed throughout this whole topic, and it's a principle worth carrying with you long after this specific video ends. When a wild animal appears to save a human, researchers generally consider several different possible underlying explanations before settling on any single interpretation, and it's worth walking through these different possibilities individually rather than jumping straight to the most emotionally satisfying explanation, since the more mundane explanations often turn out to be more scientifically defensible, even if they're less immediately compelling as a story. Let's start with the simplest, least dramatic explanation first, because it likely accounts for a meaningful percentage of these documented cases. Curiosity and exploratory behavior, misinterpreted by the human, involved as a deliberate rescue attempt. Many social intelligent animal species, dolphins in particular, display strong exploratory curiosity toward unfamiliar objects and creatures in their environment, including struggling humans. A dolphin nudging or pushing a swimmer might, in some specific documented cases, simply reflect general investigative or playful behavior, rather than any specific, deliberate intention to help. From the human's own perspective, in a moment of genuine panic and distress, being pushed or nudged toward safety by a large, powerful animal understandably gets interpreted and later remembered as a deliberate act of rescue, even if the animal's actual underlying motivation was considerably less purposeful or human-like than that framing suggests. Let's talk about a second, closely related possible explanation: certain species' instinctive tendency to support struggling or distressed creatures in their environment, a behavior that likely evolved for reasons entirely unrelated to humans specifically. Dolphins, for example, are well documented supporting injured or struggling members of their own pod, physically helping keep an injured or weakened dolphin near the surface so it can continue breathing, a critical behavior given that dolphins are air-breathing mammals that will drown without regular access to the surface. Some researchers propose that this same deeply ingrained supportive instinct, evolved specifically to help injured pod members, might occasionally get triggered by a struggling human in the water, since a distressed, thrashing human swimmer might trigger similar underlying behavioral cues to a distressed, struggling dolphin, even though the dolphin obviously isn't capable of consciously recognizing the human as a different species requiring a different kind of consideration. This particular explanation is seriously compelling from a scientific standpoint, because rather than requiring any sophisticated cross-species empathy or deliberate reasoning on the animal's part at all, it simply requires an existing, well-documented instinctive behavior pattern, evolved for an entirely different, species-specific purpose, occasionally getting triggered by a human who happens to present similar behavioral cues to whatever normally triggers that instinct within the animal's own species. This kind of behavioral generalization, an instinct evolved for one specific purpose accidentally applying to a superficially similar situation involving a different species entirely, is actually a pretty well-documented broader pattern in animal behavior research more generally, not something unique or specific to this particular topic. Let's talk about elephants specifically now, because they represent one of the more frequently cited examples in this whole conversation, and their documented behavior offers some remarkably interesting additional angles worth exploring in real detail. Elephants demonstrate well-documented, sophisticated social cognition and what researchers generally describe as clear indicators of empathy-related behavior within their own species, and even in some well-documented cases, toward other species entirely, including documented cases of elephants appearing to assist injured or distressed animals from completely different species. Given what's already understood about elephant cognition more broadly, including their capacity for individual recognition and long-term memory discussed at length elsewhere, it's at least scientifically plausible that elephant rescue behavior toward humans reflects something closer to real, generalized empathetic responsiveness conscious, rather than purely reflexive species-specific instinct misapplied to an unfamiliar situation. This doesn't mean researchers can definitively conclude elephants are consciously, deliberately choosing to save a human out of anything resembling human-style moral reasoning. But given the broader body of research on elephant social cognition and empathy-related behavior more generally, the elephant cases probably deserve to be taken more seriously as potential examples of genuine cross-species empathetic response, compared to some of the other documented cases that likely have simpler, more purely instinctive underlying explanations. Let's talk about the broader scientific concept of altruism in animals more generally, because understanding how researchers think about animal altruism as a general category helps make sense of the specific human rescue cases discussed throughout this topic. Biologists studying altruistic behavior across the animal kingdom generally distinguish between several different underlying categories. Kin selection explains altruistic behavior directed toward genetic relatives, since helping a relative survive indirectly helps propagate shared genes, even at some cost to the individual providing the help. Reciprocal altruism explains helping behavior directed toward non-relatives within the same social group based on an expectation, whether conscious or purely instinctive, that the favor might eventually be returned at some future point. And a smaller, more contested category involves what researchers sometimes call pure or costly altruism, helping behavior that provides no clear direct or indirect benefit to the animal providing the help, extended even toward a different species entirely, which is obviously the specific category most relevant to wild animals appearing to rescue humans. This third category remains the most scientifically contested and difficult to fully explain within standard evolutionary theory, precisely because it doesn't offer any obvious, straightforward genetic or reciprocal benefit to the animal engaging in the behavior. Some researchers argue that apparent cross-species altruism toward humans likely represents an evolutionary byproduct, an instinct that evolved for one of the other, more standard reasons, kin selection, or reciprocal altruism within the animal's own species, simply generalizing or misfiring when triggered by an unfamiliar species, presenting sufficiently similar behavioral or sensory cues. This connects directly back to the instinct generalization explanation already discussed regarding dolphins specifically, but framed within this broader theoretical context that applies across the field of animal behavior research more generally, rather than being some special explanation invented specifically to address human rescue stories alone. Let's talk about mirror self-recognition and its connection to empathy for a moment too, because this represents an interesting related research thread worth mentioning. Species that pass mirror self-recognition tests, a standard research method used to assess whether an animal recognizes its own reflection as itself rather than as another animal, tend to be species researchers also associate with higher-order social cognition and stronger evidence of empathy-related behavior more broadly. Elephants, dolphins, and great apes all fall into this specific category. And it's probably not a coincidence that these same species also show up disproportionately often in documented cases of apparent cross-species rescue behavior toward humans. This pattern suggests a plausible, testable connection between the underlying cognitive sophistication required for self-recognition and the cognitive sophistication that might also be required for genuine, generalized empathetic responsiveness extending beyond an animal's own species, though researchers are careful to note this remains a correlational pattern rather than definitive proof of a direct causal relationship between the two capacities. Let's talk about a few specific, well-documented historical cases worth examining in a bit more detail, because grounding this discussion in actual documented examples helps move beyond purely abstract theoretical discussion. One widely reported and reasonably well-documented case involved a group of dolphins in New Zealand that reportedly circled and shepherded a group of distressed swimmers away from a nearby shark, an incident witnessed and later described by a lifeguard present at the scene. Marine biologists examining this specific account have generally treated it as a plausible example of the instinct generalization explanation already discussed, dolphins engaging in group protective behavior, similar to how they'd respond to a shark threatening a member of their own pod, rather than necessarily reflecting deliberate, conscious reasoning about the specific danger facing the human swimmers involved. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Another frequently cited case involves a gorilla at a zoo who was documented gently protecting and cradling a young child who had fallen into the gorilla's enclosure, carrying the unconscious child to a location accessible to zoo staff and human caretakers, rather than reacting with aggression or indifference. Primatologists studying this specific, well-documented incident have generally pointed to it as a particularly compelling example, given great apes' well-established capacity for empathy-related behavior within their own species and, in various other documented contexts, toward other species as well, making genuine protective concern a scientifically reasonable interpretation in this specific case, especially compared to cases involving species with less established, less thoroughly researched evidence of sophisticated social cognition and empathy more broadly. These specific, well-documented cases are worth including because they illustrate something important about how researchers actually approach this topic responsibly. Rather than applying one single, blanket explanation uniformly across every single reported incident regardless of species, careful researchers weigh the specific species involved, that species' broader documented cognitive and social capacities, and the specific behavioral details of each individual case before offering any tentative interpretation, remaining appropriately cautious about overclaiming certainty in either direction toward either dismissive skepticism or uncritical, emotionally driven acceptance of the most dramatic possible interpretation. Let's talk about a third possible explanation worth considering too: territorial or protective behavior that happens to incidentally benefit a nearby human, without the animal specifically intending to help that human at all. Some documented cases involving wild animals appearing to defend or protect humans from an approaching predator or threat may actually reflect the animal defending its own territory or responding to the approaching predator as a direct threat to itself, with the human's safety simply being an incidental, secondary benefit of behavior that was really motivated by the animal's own territorial or self-protective instincts rather than any specific concern for the human's well-being at all. This particular explanation is worth taking seriously, specifically because it highlights an important general principle relevant throughout this entire topic. When interpreting animal behavior, it's important to consider whether an animal's actions might serve the animal's own interests directly, even when those actions happen to also benefit a nearby human as a secondary, incidental effect. Not every case where a human benefits from an animal's behavior necessarily reflects the animal specifically, deliberately acting on the human's behalf. Let's talk about domesticated and semi-domesticated animals for a moment too, because this category deserves separate consideration from the purely wild animal cases already discussed. Dogs, and to a lesser extent certain other domesticated species, have well-documented cases of actively, deliberately protecting or assisting specific humans they've formed a bond with, echoing patterns already discussed extensively regarding how dogs specifically perceive, evaluate, and form individual attachments toward particular humans. These cases involve a meaningfully different underlying relationship compared to a wild dolphin or wild elephant encountering an unfamiliar human they've never previously interacted with, since domesticated animals have been shaped by thousands of years of selective breeding specifically favoring cooperative, protective behavior directed toward humans, making genuine, deliberate protective intention considerably more scientifically plausible in these specific cases compared to purely wild animal encounters involving no prior relationship or history between the specific animal and human involved. Now let's talk about how researchers actually try to evaluate and distinguish between these various possible explanations in specific documented cases, because this represents a seriously difficult methodological challenge worth appreciating directly, one that shapes how cautiously any responsible researcher should approach even the most compelling individual anecdote. Unlike controlled laboratory research, most of these dramatic wild animal rescue stories occur spontaneously, in the wild, without any researcher present to carefully observe and record the full context and sequence of events as they actually unfolded. This means researchers are frequently working from incomplete, after-the-fact accounts provided by the human involved, who was, understandably, experiencing significant fear and distress at the time, conditions that aren't especially conducive to careful, objective observation and recall of exactly what happened and in what specific order. This methodological limitation means a considerable amount of appropriate scientific caution, and humility is warranted when evaluating these specific stories, however emotionally compelling they might be. Researchers generally try to look for broader patterns across multiple, independently documented cases involving the same species, rather than drawing strong conclusions from any single, isolated incident, since a broader pattern showing up consistently across many separate, independently documented cases provides considerably stronger evidence for a genuine, real behavioral tendency, compared to any single, potentially misremembered or incompletely observed individual account. Let's talk about a related consideration worth mentioning too: publication and selection bias specific to this particular topic, a factor that quietly shapes almost everything the general public actually gets to see and hear about regarding this entire subject. Stories of wild animals appearing to rescue humans get shared, reported on, and remembered vastly more often than the presumably far more common instances of wild animals behaving with complete indifference toward a struggling human, or in some cases behaving in ways that are actively dangerous or harmful toward humans they encounter. This selective attention and memory means the available body of wild animal rescue stories almost certainly represents a highly skewed, unrepresentative sample of overall wild animal behavior toward humans more broadly. Rather than reflecting some kind of common, typical, or expected pattern of behavior, researchers should generally anticipate from wild animals encountering distressed humans under ordinary circumstances. This detail is worth appreciating because it adds an important layer of caution to the entire topic. These stories are truly fascinating and worth exploring seriously, but they represent rare, notable exceptions, specifically because they're unusual and remarkable, not because they reflect some common, typical, predictable pattern of behavior you should generally expect from wild animals under ordinary circumstances. The vast majority of wild animal encounters with distressed humans presumably involve simple avoidance, indifference, or in some cases genuine danger, rather than anything resembling deliberate rescue behavior, which is precisely why the rescue cases that do occur end up receiving so much attention and become so widely shared and remembered in the first place. Let's talk about a specific, particularly well-documented category of cases worth exploring in a bit more depth: whales and sharks, specifically documented instances of whales appearing to position themselves protectively between a human diver and a nearby shark, one of the more visually dramatic and widely circulated categories of footage within this entire broader topic. Marine biologists studying these specific documented cases have proposed several possible explanations, including the possibility that the whale may be responding to the shark as a direct competitive or territorial threat to itself, rather than specifically protecting the human diver, similar to the territorial explanation already discussed regarding other species. Some researchers also point out that certain whale species display well-documented protective behavior toward other vulnerable creatures more broadly, sometimes including other species entirely, which could suggest a more generalized protective instinct potentially extending to humans under certain specific circumstances, echoing the same, broader, instinct generalization explanation already discussed regarding dolphins specifically. Let's talk about emotional contagion for a moment too, because this represents another relevant scientific concept worth bringing into the discussion. Emotional contagion refers to the tendency of one animal's emotional or physiological state to influence and shift toward matching the emotional or physiological state of another nearby animal, a phenomenon well documented across many social species, including humans, and generally considered a simpler, more basic precursor to full, complex empathy rather than empathy itself in its most sophisticated form. Some researchers propose that a struggling, panicking human might trigger emotional contagion in a nearby social animal, essentially transmitting some version of that distress signal to the animal, which could then prompt approach and interactive behavior without necessarily requiring the animal to have anything resembling a conscious, deliberate understanding of the specific danger the human is facing or an explicit intention to resolve it. This concept offers a useful middle ground between the purely reflexive, mechanical, instinct generalization explanation and the more cognitively demanding claim of full, deliberate, empathetic reasoning, suggesting that at least some documented rescue behavior might reflect something in between these two extremes, a real emotional response to another creature's evident distress without necessarily requiring the kind of sophisticated, human-like reasoning about causes, consequences, and appropriate remedial action that a fully deliberate, planned rescue would seem to imply. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full, honest answer to why wild animals sometimes appear to save humans turns out to involve considerably more scientific complexity and appropriate caution than the simple, emotionally satisfying animals understand and care about us interpretation that tends to dominate how these stories typically get shared and discussed. Several distinct, scientifically plausible explanations likely account for different specific cases: simple curiosity or exploratory behavior misinterpreted as rescue. Instinctive behaviors evolved for supporting an animal's own species accidentally triggered by a struggling human, presenting similar behavioral cues: territorial or self-protective behavior that incidentally benefits a nearby human, and in certain specific cases, particularly involving species like elephants with well-documented sophisticated social cognition, something closer to genuine, generalized empathetic responsiveness extending beyond the animal's own species. None of these explanations require dismissing these stories as meaningless or uninteresting. If anything, understanding the actual range of possible underlying mechanisms makes the whole topic considerably more scientifically interesting rather than less, since it reveals a seriously complex, still only partially understood landscape of animal behavior and cognition, rather than a single, simple, uniform explanation applying identically across every single documented case, regardless of species or specific circumstances. So the next time you come across a viral video of a wild animal appearing to rescue a human from danger, it's worth appreciating that you're likely witnessing one of several meaningfully different possible underlying phenomena: curiosity, instinct generalization, territorial self-interest, or in certain specific cases, something considerably closer to authentic cross-species empathy, each equally fascinating in its own right, even if none of them quite match the simple, uncomplicated story of conscious, deliberate animal heroism that tends to accompany how these videos typically get shared and discussed online. It's worth adding one final note before wrapping up, because it connects this entire topic back to a broader theme worth carrying forward. Every specific explanation discussed throughout this topic — curiosity, instinct generalization, territorial self-interest, emotional contagion, and genuine cross-species empathy — represents an active area of ongoing scientific research rather than a fully settled, closed question. As monitoring technology, behavioral research methods, and comparative cognition studies across different species continue advancing, researchers will likely continue refining, and in some cases revising, exactly which explanation best accounts for which specific documented cases, meaning the current understanding summarized throughout this topic represents the best available interpretation given current evidence, rather than any kind of permanently settled final scientific verdict on the matter, which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If the true underlying explanation behind these remarkable moments varies this much depending on the specific species and circumstances involved, sometimes reflecting genuine empathy, sometimes reflecting simple, generalized instinct, and sometimes reflecting pure incidental self-interest. What does that suggest about how carefully we should examine our own assumptions the next time we witness an animal doing something that looks, on the surface, remarkably and touchingly human, rather than reaching immediately for whichever interpretation happens to make the best possible story?